everybody, and welcome back to the Utopias podcast. Today, I'm really excited and honored to bring on a European colleague, a well-known scholar, activist, policy advisor, and climate-related thinker. And this is my colleague and friend, the German scholar, Maja Göpel. Maja is a scholar who has written a few really interesting books and has a forthcoming book called We Can Do Better, A Departure into the World of Tomorrow. And what Maja does is she's a scholar who looks at transformations and sustainability. These are often buzzwords that circle around, but there's an interesting question amidst some of the challenges that we see all around the planet related to climate change. What is the future looking like that is positive and transformational? So Maja is a best-selling author of books also like Rethinking Our World, An Invitation to Rescue Our Future, and The Great Mind Shift. And you'll hear in this conversation discussions of the environment, of human development, of systems-level thinking, where you bring environmental concerns together with economic, political, labor-oriented ones, cultural ones, etc. And this is a very refreshing conversation that looks at things from the European perspective, but also has a lot of hopefulness and so many different pieces of advice and ideas and actual practical ways in which we can move our planet into a more sustainable, more coherent future, more harmony. So introducing Maja Göpel, this podcast interview was originally recorded last October, and she is a great example of someone who truly is devoted to repairing and caring for our planet on many different levels. So enjoy this conversation here on Utopias. I'm so happy to be in conversation with you and really grateful for your time. And thank you for joining us today on Utopias, Maja.
Thank you for having me, Ramesh. Pleasure to catch up.
It's awesome. And so, I'll start. I don't want to embarrass you or anything, but I'm going to tell a little personal story. I met Maja at a conference that is, quite a fancy conference in Munich, of course, in Bavaria, in Germany, that's called Digital Life and Design. And I had spoken there in 2020, right before the start of the pandemic. And there are some good folks definitely putting on the conference and at the conference and speaking at the conference. But I did notice at this conference, like some others that I've occasionally been invited to, that there was sort of this foregrounding of technology, like, technology is taking us forward and forward. But the question of what type of forward is that? And is this all about technology? And what are our lives on the planet like? And so Maja gave a talk at the conference that I found to be so resonant and so inspiring and so important relative to some of the talks that you see at these kinds of, thought leader so-called conferences, which were not really asking the big questions about life. And the coolest thing about that for me was seeing how Maja's talk was received. I was sitting in the audience, how people actually were very inspired and appreciative of her talk and her work more generally. And then the funniest part for me was seeing how many people wanted to take selfies with you, Maja, afterward. And I was like, okay, I thought I was just hanging out with like an amazing fellow progressive colleague, but in reality, I'm with a celebrity in Germany. So anyway, I just thought it was that spoke a lot to your spirit and your heart, and I think the clarity of your vision, Maja. So I just wanted to mention that to you.
No, it was funny. It was a funny moment for me as well, because it was after in the fall, I had this, as you might have experienced as well, these moments of people trying to really take you down. So proper full-on public attacks and newspapers writing about me, and it was for several weeks. So it's been such a harsh time. For the very first time, I've really been at the center of this. Whilst my book came out, incidentally, they published it 1 week before the book came. And so it was a bit like coming to a place where everybody was giving me the thumbs up after all that turmoil. And so for me, it was surprising as well how much people wanted to talk to me, and that it was very positive was obviously very nice after all that's happened. So I do remember that evening as well, when we're sitting in this big hall and everything's crowding in and out and being very chatty.
And sometimes notoriety, which is nothing that you did yourself, and popularity can be very connected with one another. The fortunate thing, I think, in your case is you are very much someone who has a vision and stands for a vision and stands for certain principles of what planetary transformation can look like in relation to these alarming threats that we're seeing to life itself, human life, but other forms of life too, non-human life as well, amidst what we might call climate change, climate crisis. There's a lot of different kinds of phrases for it. So, maybe I could just start by asking you not just about that book that had come out, as well as, a new book I know you mentioned you're working on, but sort of the larger question of what are the causes that you, as a scholar and as a publicly engaged, intellectual activist, whatever you may identify with, what are the main causes that you're sort of trying to advocate for and inspire us toward?
No, thank you. Also, thank you for asking for the kind of roots of it all, right? Because it's so often that everybody just has answers and slightly tilted answers to ones before. But I always start talking a lot about what do we have either with the two ingredients of human existence, so humans and what we've been given this home called planet, or our self-image. I quite often take that one as well, because I think it's one of the most powerful lines in the Brundtland Report from 1987, when it does say the images that we got from the space, looking back at planet Earth as this blue marble, slightly patterned with green and white, etc., in 1968, completely changed the way that we should look at ourselves. So similar to the Copernican revolution, to really say, who are we and where are we positioned? And that we'd have to learn to understand and live with those networks of life that were visible from there for the first time. And I do notice that it does allow for a different conversation, but I do also notice that it's hardly ever part of the conversation. And that is where I feel we should start, to really think, especially when we think about the speed with which things are changing now, and also the types of technology discussions we have, which you're much of an expert in. Unless we ask this question, who do we want to be? Very quickly going to change who we are and might not have even thought about it. And so this is, for me, the entry point. What's the human potential, and who do we want to be, both in the way of transitioning into the next planetary phase, but also how do we envision that phase to look like?
I think that's one of the most important questions that actually is rarely the question that circulates, right? Is a question of what is life, and how do we wish for life to be? What has life been? And also really locating that in relation to ourselves as Homo sapiens, but recognizing that we Homo sapiens have always had and continue to have relationships with many other non-humans, right? Like plants, animals, fungi, etc., right? And so are you concerned that there might be, like, why that I'm curious why you think that question is not the main question that is being asked, whether it's by politicians, by journalists. Is that the question that climate scientists are asking? Like, who's asking that question, and how do we get that question out, and why might it not be the major question on our minds?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've built a lot of things, including language and numerical ways of steering ourselves, that are blinding us to that existence, right? Or to that root of existence. And when we think about the European history and continent, a lot traces back to the First Enlightenment, to all the ideas about how can we differentiate human life from other forms of life. So how do we subordinate nature to make it conducive to our needs? How do we exploit it ever more effectively and efficiently? how natural sciences became much more experimental and much more vetting themselves from the stories that we had from church or the clerics or the aristocrats, and to say we're going to see ourselves, we're going to look at this ourselves. And it all became very analytical. And I think that was huge in terms of the progress that was made and our understanding of things, how they hang together. But we went a lot into the analytical, the bits and details, and then it kind of forgot about what are the details embedded in. So neither the systemic ways of how things hang together, nor that there are things that you can't quite observe, because lots is energy and even some spiritual things that we can't even explain, and emotions, etc., that go far beyond what we could dissect with a microscope or anything like that. And then I think with quantum physics and all those moments, some of that came back, and some of this notion of, whoa, maybe there's a surplus existence to what we can see and feel directly. But we haven't really taken that understanding out into what we might call everyday reality or work life. It's placed somewhere in churches or at home or in your own spiritual practice, or somewhere tugged away from how normal life is and how you're professionally engaging. And so I think it is, at least in our societies with our cultural background in Europe, that is part and parcel of what we're regaining. How the new work agenda, or how the systems paradigm, when we see how it's cutting across different disciplines, is allowing for that to come back in. And having groups talking about science and spirituality, or saying, how about we talk about the good life, not only on Sundays in church, but really this is the essence of what progress might want to be aimed at. And it's a bit more than a GDP indicator, ain't it? But it is, yeah, it's quite difficult to get out of the numerical, quantified, metric-oriented way of looking at the world, because I guess it gave some feeling of control, it gave some feel of sorting, and hierarchies very easy to establish, some prediction was possible, and now it feels uncomfortable to go back to, oh, maybe it's all a bit more fluffy, it's all a bit more dynamic, it's more evolutionary, and we don't quite know what is going to emerge. I mean, all these terms seem alien to the very mechanic way of having looked at the world before. So I think it is a regaining the space that we're at right now.
I mean, I appreciate the spirit and the optimism behind that, because, you know, as you alluded to, if we even date back to the times of the Enlightenment, which undergirded so much of scientific revolutions and scientific progress, a lot of the beliefs of that time were based upon the distancing of the knower and the known, right? I mean, we look, for example, at classical like botanists like Carl Linnaeus, I think he's Swedish, botanist who had these taxonomies of mapping flora and fauna, which actually indicated, you know, like, so different species of animals or different species of plants or what have you existed sort of independently or just in hierarchical relationships with other things, right? And before that, Carl Linnaeus had actually coined the term Homo sapiens, where he described certain races in very racist ways in that period. But basically, that idea that, you know, everything outside of we humans, and sometimes even we humans ourselves, is studyable from afar rather than actively co-constructing ourselves, is, I think, the big issue. I mean, I think I'm curious what you think about this. You know, like the pandemic, for example, showed us, and I think you said this when I met you, that human migration and the destruction of a lot of natural habitats and territories is directly connected to the emergence of new forms of life, in this case, a COVID-19 virus, right? So some certain lives are created that might kill other lives based on the encroachment upon the lives of other living beings, right? So, you know, if we think it was not created in a lab, but it was created in the market, it doesn't matter to me much. But either way, they both indicate the same thing, which is the kind of the overreach of humans into and kind of the erosion of natural systems that we think we can territorialize or turn into property or something that's studyable, rather than looking at them as relational. That other species relate to us, like we eat plants, we eat animals, they're not dead. their lives influence ours, so I guess that's the theme I wanted to just kind of touch on a little bit, which I feel like you're also touching on, which is what does it take? And you're saying this is emerging to kind of look at we human beings more in relationships with one another, but also our planet. Our planet's not like inert.
Yeah. No, I think the pandemic had a lot of opportunities for us to do so. I always, yes, make reference to Zoonosen. I don't know if that's the proper English term as well, but that's the term we're saying it when the origin comes from, the fauna that it's jumped onto us, not a lab. So basically, what it shows as well is how much things go in and out of us. So if we were formerly thinking that we could be somehow distinct from the rest that we call environment, environ is like it's around us, but not through us, as you just said. And I always use the COVID as an example. The virus goes inside of us and travels with us and goes outside to someone else. And we're just sitting next to each other and we're connected through virus loads. If we needed that, that should be the learning, because obviously all the molecules that we're inhaling, exhaling are in and throughout us multiple times probably. And the things that we eat and put out and re-eat once it's changed its form again, people start thinking, oh, whoa, really? But it's just the normal way that life operates. And it's so funny in a certain way to wonder how that could be taken out of our normal way of looking at things, up to the point that kids don't understand that milk doesn't come from a container, but actually from a cow. I mean, where have we gone? And this is why I do feel also with the connectivity that COVID showed us in various areas, at least we had a brief recognition again how important agriculture is, because the shelves were empty. And people were starting to think, where does this stuff actually come from every single day? And some of them got really angry, and that shows you how far we've come in our culture. So, why isn't my food there in the typical amounts of stuff? And Germany was the toilet paper. I think we've been ridiculed around the whole world for that, where people were hoarding most of. And then there had two ways of reacting to it. And I felt one was the angry one, and the next day you go yet a bit earlier and you hoard yet a bit more, and you were kind of antagonized by everybody that could take away from you. So that's been the me, myself, and I in the working. And the other part was that some people were thinking, wow, okay, we understand now there is provisioning happening, and it is only happening at a certain scale, a certain amount, and at a certain speed. So we might want to think about how can we make sure loads of people participate in the circuits of provisioning. And those were the ones that took less. Those were the ones that took some from their neighbors that couldn't go shopping in the peak hours because they were risk patients, etc. So I think we had the two prototypical ways of reacting. One, oof, going down in the molecule thinking, and you're bumping against all the other egoists who are not really interested in any but yourself. Or to say, whoa, this is the moment to open up. This is the moment to consider. This is the moment to go big and wide. And then to see how we make the connections work. And that's obviously always a big shift I find in system thinking, that you say to people, don't stare at the elements, look at the connections. And then you can start talking about social technologies that we've built, like institutions and incentives and cultural frames, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, you've made a great point in a lot of things of yours, both I've read or seen, about this whole sort of growth sort of mindset that's an extremely narrow idea of what growth actually is, that tends to drive a lot of decisions, whether they're policy decisions, economic decisions, technological decisions that are being made, that don't consider what that narrow vision of growth does to actually stymie or even kill other types of things that could be growing, right? And so, the term often used in economics and political economy is externalities, those things that are sort of outside the narrow equation. And so, as someone, and you use this term systems thinking, right? You've used it twice now since we started our conversation today, is a way out of that, right? It kind of looks at the self in relation to many other forces and institutions and networks and so on. So I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what a systems-oriented vision could look like or does look like in relation to challenges and threats, which are also opportunities, whether it's COVID, whether it's, the incredible effects of climate change, whether it's global inequalities that we see occurring, whether it's disinformation and polarization. These are all big challenges. What does a systems vision mean? What does that mean, so everyone who's listening and seeing this can understand this in a very lay sense? And how could that be applied to some of the challenges that I know you really advocate for?
No, thank you. I think maybe the most basic definition of a system is that it is a network of elements that are programmed to achieve a particular thing. So there's always a purpose within the development and coexistence, and there's always the connections, and it's always a dynamic with which the development happens. So I've tried very much to reduce, because complex systems theory can get really crazy. I mean, not as bad as in quantum physics. That's where I think, great that we have disciplines that I don't have to know every single one of them. But there are obviously some patterns that you also find in other disciplines that are coming to the complex thinking, including economics, by the way. And it is, I think, the three aspects that I've always tried to point out in, also to show how this view differs from what we're used to, is A, to really look at the connections, to really look at networks that you're embedded in. B, to always understand that there's a dynamic of development that's not necessarily linear, but that can speed up and then have these kind of hockey stick patterns and then have tipping points. So there's a interesting terminology there with the positive and negative feedback loops. So a trend is always accelerated by something when it's a positive feedback loop, and it can be decelerated or balanced if it's a negative feedback loop. So positive and negative is not good or bad in that. It just means it's speeding up or slowing down a particular trend you're observing. And the most prominent example, obviously, is GDP, that we say going up means a positive development. I think we all have that when we close our eyes, when you put the Google image search on growth or development even, it has the upward curve. So we're very much in that direction. But what never happens is to show how the upward curve is hitting something or where it might go. There is a bit of planet before, right? So it is where are the trends going, and why do we consider an exponentially growing trend? And that's another very, very important concept there. Exponentiality means that you're growing faster and faster in comparison to the year before. And that's in GDP. So 1% of GDP growth this year means you've taken it from the baseline of last year. And last year, GDP growth of 1% means it was taken from the baseline before. And since our baselines are growing every single year, a percentage increase means the sum of it is a bigger increase than the years before. So we're lamenting about a 1% GDP growth being terrible, but it's still a bigger growth than having a 1.1 or something GDP growth of the year before. And I don't think many people understand this. Exponentiality means that the curve gets steeper and steeper. And this is where systems or our system of observation comes in. And they say we've had this happen since the 1950s in particular. When you look at all the curves of extraction, as you mentioned, that term being a very important one, extracting minerals, extracting fish, extracting water, extracting and pumping in by using the extracted fossil fuels, extracting fossils and pumping out.
Extracting labor, extracting attention, like dopamine. That's what happens a lot with social media. Yeah.
And the most important thing always is the third aspect. So you have the connectivity thing to look at, the dynamic, how you're traveling on your trends. And the third one, what's the purpose? Because the purpose of good human lives is good human lives and not GDP growth. And we do know from observing that a particular rate of increase of materials and a particular level of material consumption are good for us, because we do need to provide for ourselves, and shelter is better than not shelter. All those things are normal, but then having more and more and more, having to work more and more and more and faster and faster in order to maintain a particular material consumption level where you can't even connect it with well-being increases anymore. That's the kind of pattern we've trapped ourselves in. And this is why there is hope from that kinds of observations to say we could get out of some of the exponentially curves and say we can balance them to regrow something else. Say we're providing differently for humans in a way that's going to regenerate the growth of the ecosystems rather than really destroying the regeneration and the growth of ecosystems, as we've been doing for the last 200 years.
Yeah, because also even some of these narrow ideas of growth, like GDP, may not actually be the right ways to look at development or transformation or what have you. I mean, we even saw during the pandemic a certain point where the stock market valuation was at its highest
Yeah.
while the GDP was dropping, which is
Yeah.
which means that no longer are we talking about markets when we're talking about capitalism, but we're also not even necessarily talking about profitability always, right? Like I like to give the example of a company like Uber. It's worth I don't know, a couple hundred um like millions and billions, and is not profitable, right? So what is and many indigenous communities, for example, that I've worked with, for example, in Latin America, and often tell me, like in Mexico and stuff, tell me like, oh, like our purpose is buen vivir, living well, literally exactly the words you just said, like living a good life, like living, what does that look like, right? So if I were to take a sort of a systems approach that says, hey, all of this acceleration and exponential, like growth in a very narrow sense, is actually destroying other species and systems that we actually need and rely upon. And instead take, and you use this word, and it was literally the title of my talk at the same conference, a regenerative
Yes.
vision. You bring it back, you regenerate, you recreate it, just like repairing. You take things that have maybe once integrated or systemically connected that were individuated and broken apart, and you repair them, like you bring them back together. So let's talk about that in a very applied and specific way with relation to environment and climate transformation, knowing that these are not like entities, but these are other systems that we are part of us. So what are some strategies that actually look at growth in a much more expansive way, or maybe just look at good life in a more open way, by which what are some policies, some approaches that we can apply right now, and maybe you're fighting to get applied in the European Union, to have a transformation that lifts all of us up?
Well, I think we have to dare to see. That's probably the very first thing. And you mentioned the statistical accounts, which are right now being discussed. By the way, there's a UN working group on this to really reconsider again what are the core indicators and the core accounting schemes that we do need in order to know which way we're going. And the most important, once again, to differentiate GDP once more from what we would want to look at in order to know whether A, we're living well now, and in particular, whether we can live well in the future, is the stocks. So we're talking about a flow and stock accounting in systems. And the flow means the things that travel from one element to another, etc. It can be information, it can be money, it can be materials. And the stocks is where things are being held. It can be a reservoir of something, it can be a bank account, it can be this, it can be that. And then obviously stocks become flows when they are moved around, etc. But the amounts in our stocks shouldn't be totally degraded, because otherwise the flows can't continue. So it's logical as a bathtub kind of idea, right? Once it's all out the water, you can't lead it somewhere else. And so that once the stock's empty, you won't have flows anymore. And this is exactly what we're warning of when we're talking about tipping points. And I think it's easier to imagine sometimes that in the atmosphere is a bit big, but if you think of a pond and overfishing, it becomes much more easy to imagine, because you're fishing and fishing, you're fishing a bit more and fishing a bit more. It looks quite well. And then you're noticing, I don't quite fish as many. And you think, one more won't matter. But what happens is at one point, a small little incremental change, just one more fish, means that the whole fish stocks might collapse very quickly, which is the tipping point, because you reduce the amount of stocks to a degree that it can't replenish itself. It can't regenerate itself. It first starts regenerating slower, but unless you're cautious enough and notice, and that's actually a term in system thinking, that critical slowing down. When you notice the trends are shaping towards too much slowing down, then you should be having a big warning sign out there and say, how can we restabilize this? If you overlook it, which we tend to do all the time, then all of a sudden you have a collapse, because the fish can't replenish or regenerate or just become as plentiful again in the next year as they did before. So this one more step can have very different effects to what we're used to observing as effects from the former one steps, right? And this is exactly the kind of logic. And so the first thing is to dare to see where are we at with our stocks. And that means stop the terminology of externality, because externality is not gone, it's just somewhere else, but it's still in the system. That's maybe one of the big haggles that we have in economics. It's just externalized from your balance sheet, which is great, makes your balance sheet looks pretty good, but it's somewhere else, right? And so it's internally part of the system that we all depend on in the future. Redefining of how successful we are is happening or is being asked for, because it's not there. Germany still, even though there have been G7 promises, etc., have a national account of our natural capital, which would be the economic way of looking at nature, right? You're looking at how much do we have. And the first thing that we got asked when I was at the Bioeconomy Council of the government's like, how much biomass do we have? How much can we grow with that? Like, what do you mean grow? What's supposed to grow? Do you want to grow forests? Do you want to grow this? Do you want to grow that? Or do you just want to shove it into GDP? That won't tell you anything about the distribution. Even if we rectified it for the natural damage, it doesn't say anything about distribution, nor does it say about technological gains that we have right now that kind of circumvent the normal pay for something that you take as a service. So it's not really very mappable from that view. And you also, unless you really are solidly making it a non-positive in GDP when you're destroying nature, you're still counting for positive progress when you're cleaning up after a natural disaster. So whilst everybody would say it's completely logical that we are now not making progress, we're having to put a lot of people, a lot of materials, a lot of machinery, and a lot of money to build something up again, like we did after hurricanes, after floods, after droughts, after all these damages that are happening to climate change. On GDP, it would register positively. I think one of the most macabre sayings is, if you really want to ramp up GDP, you need a war. Because you look at the expenditures that are necessary for that, and GDP was invented during war times, by the way, to see how can we is it possible for us in very short term, was the question, to ramp up production of military equipment to be able to win the war against Germans? So that was primary questions behind the moments when that kind of indicator came out. How can we ramp up in the short term? And then we made it the thing that we continually benchmark our economies against. So the whole setup has never been one of neither well-being nor a very good account for something where you go for a peaceful, stable development where maybe everybody has a space in it. So first look very honestly at the stocks, and then we can start looking at strategies, how to rebuild the stocks, how to really improve doing good economic outcomes, good services in particular to people with much less ecological footprint.
Well, that's great. So that's actually really where I was going to go and ask you about. So when you say stocks, you mean like repositories, like natural resources, or, I don't even know if we want to call it that term, like the fish, like, are the fish plentiful? Like, that's what you mean, not stocks like stock market.
Stock market, no, stocks.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I figured.
Yeah.
Because it's actually a very interesting question, right? So like for everybody listening and or watching this, like think about this. What if you had the opportunity to get together with other folks of all different stripes of life around the planet and together make some conclusions, find some areas of consensus of what a good life would look like? And then you sort of, in a way, I don't know if the word is reverse engineer, but you sort of look at, oh, well, that means a good life involves plentiful oxygen. A good life involves eating food that's not contaminated with chemicals. A good life involves this, that, and the other, right? So, and then you look at those phenomena, and then you think about what, does the thriving, just as an example from your example, of fish require? Like, look at it from the fish perspective, because the fish are important for the thriving of human life in a certain way. I think it's very, very refreshing way of looking at things, because you don't start with a narrow, I don't even know if I want to call it vision, a narrow phenomenon that you're optimizing for, never mind the destruction it creates everywhere around it. But you actually start with a much more, we could call it, question of what life could be or should be, that we can all get our heads around. To me, that's a very refreshing approach toward it. So, I mean, I want to ask you, how far have you been able to get in, at least in the European Union, if not more widely with the UN, in terms of trying to get this vision on the table? Like, I mean, and how is that going in Germany, right? Which we know has had a lot of reliance on fossil fuels, right? Including from Russia, right? Like where, you know, and even here in the US with some of Biden's decisions to move cars toward a more electric cars and so on, you know, that came with also the authorization of pipelines. And that also came with a discussion of where does the electricity come from? Is that from coal, etc.? So, you know, how have you been able to, like, where are you at in terms of getting these issues on the table in the European Union, in the UN, internationally? What are the main challenges to doing that?
Well, yeah, no, thanks. I think the main questions or challenges are still that we have this conflation of more is better, so deeply ingrained in everything. And more not only meaning more in monetary terms, but more in square meters that we're living on, more in square meters that we're calling a car that shuttles us around, more in square meters that we are traveling across in order to have a nice holiday. So it's been this expansion worldview and progress story that we're all roped into, and it's very difficult to get out of it, especially when you have a social culture of framing and status attached to it, right? And this is why I think this getting out of once I have more, I'm better than you, then I'm better off than last year, and including this terminology. We've had a discussion about it just a few days ago with a very conservative background audience coming from the big entrepreneur families that are running some of our biggest businesses still. And this thing of my children should have it better than we did was completely attached to that increase in stuff or size or money. And now we, I think, are at the point, and I think this is the conversation that can work occasionally, to say, if you still want your children to be better off, you need to do things better, because otherwise they're not going to be better off, not materially, but also not in the times of societies that they live in, right? So the better, I think, is something that we can put in the table. And just as you say, not only the good life, but how do we manage things better? And this is how I've been trying to work on it on the German level, because there's this pride of the engineering, right? The quality made in Germany. And then you can say, well, that's nice, but why are we doing things so badly? How come that a machine that we used to have in our kitchen run for 30 years, like Miele products still do occasionally, just break after 4 to 5 now? Your dishwasher needs to be replaced because it's broken. Why? That's ridiculous. I mean, those machines have nothing but a bit more digital implants changed in them. Why do they die early? What does that do as an engineer's pride, right? And so to start talking from that angle much more, and then you get into the moment where people understand it's the financials and how they work that are actually holding them back to provide the highest quality. And Miele has an issue now, because Germany is covered with all the white material or white equipment that they're selling, and their exports are not going as well because they're much more expensive than the others, because their stuff is really high quality. And now they're thinking about what to do because there's so much pressure on them. Potentially, you'd say you've really achieved a fantastic goal. Everybody has access to those machines and they're working, or you just provide them and you're selling the service if you're looking for a new business model. That's the kind of business model thinking that some of the big machine producers are now adopting. That they're saying, okay, we understand that we don't plant a huge thing everywhere, but people need access to have a certain service done. And then we can do that in one space. We can maintain it much more easily, and we can use much less resources to do so. Mobility is obviously the other example. How do we manage to get people around without having loads and loads and loads gigantic 2.5 kilogram, 2,500 kilogram heavy resource binding machines standing around 95% of the day? Crowding up our cities, right? That's the least smart way of organizing, not efficient, by the way, organizing of mobility when you look at it from an engineer's point of view. So I sometimes use that to say, just imagine people, how an extraterrestrial is looking down and then saying, look how they move themselves forward. 170 kilos sitting in 2.5 tons in order to be moved around. And then those tons hang out and don't let anybody come by. And they're always crammed up on those highways. And the little 70 to 90 kilo people get really angry and upset about it. Like, how ridiculous must that look like from space? Why don't we just do things better? When we look at least waste in harmony with the natural processes, because they can be so fascinating. And we're always celebrating ourselves for humanoid robots. Jesus, there's 8 billion humans out there. What on earth is your pride to replace that with a much less exciting version just because you made it? This whole playing God instead of saying, wow, how can we understand life and living systems and then develop the kind of technologies, including money systems as social technologies, that actually allow for life to become more alive and the living systems become much more resilient again. That'd be such a fantastic progress narrative. And the easiest now to get in is for the circular economy ways, because it does make people start thinking in systems.
Yeah, and we take what we can get and try to push the agenda forward. Whether it's circular economy, getting into the Davos scene, okay, great. And it's not about shaming or canceling. It's about looking for other views and looking at kind of what has always mattered, right? And what really matters to us all. I think it's interesting you're sort of critical of the 2-ton car with the 70 kilo or 80 kilo human in it, coming from Germany, where I'm speaking to you from California, and California is considered one of the more sort of so-called environmentally conscious states, and we have no high-speed rail system whatsoever to speak of, certainly not high speed. The incentive structures are for us to all have our own individual cars, and we look up, many of us, to what's happening in Germany. So it's all relative, right? But I think the point being that these very narrow ideas of progress or achievement or growth not only create the absence of growth, death, really, but they actually create death in other systems that actually are critical for our reliance, right? So like Monsanto, literally bioengineering, I'm sure you're not one of your favorite companies, literally bioengineering seeds to die. I'm going to force all these farmers to rely upon seeds that are genetic technologies that are designed to die, and force them out of doing their traditional modes of agriculture. And then they're forced to have to buy new seeds every time the other seeds die. It's not that different than our iPhones, same model. But then the opposite of that is the regenerative systemic vision, right? That looks at relationships and this kind of theme, which is really the theme of this podcast, caring and repairing. Not because it's some like hippie good feel good thing, but because repairing and a systemic thinking is critical to the thriving of life, as you put it. It gives me an opportunity to ask you about how life is being sort of almost, I don't want to be too dramatic with my language, but almost conceptualized through data and quantification, right? Like, okay, Maja, I feel like I'm seeing you and I'm speaking to you now, but actually it's a series of ones and zeros that are representational of your identity that I'm interacting with. And we also know that even our data right now here on Zoom are being used to train and create AI systems, so-called AI systems, that are going to be representations of ourselves, right? Zoom themselves have admitted this. What do you think is on the chopping block with individualized data quantification as a surrogate for life?
No, I mean, generally what's behind it, when you think of the mix, how new technologies emerge, is the human curiosity. And that's such a fantastic gift to have. And it's such a fantastic drive to want to find out. But then you're at the third element of systems, is the purpose moment, right? And then you see the purpose changes in a fundamental way when big money is crowded in. And you see that in all the big tech startups, for example. Even Facebook, I think, might be one of the most interesting ones, because I looked at all the reports for the most recent book, the Frances Hogan one, as one of the prime examples where the declared purpose of a company and of the development of a new technology offering is completely different from the lived purpose underneath. And that's when you start being or hiding away where you're actually going by declaring something else that sounds nice and shiny around. And I think this sentence that's the core of it is, we create meaningful social interactions, something very similar. That must be the original quote that Mark Zuckerberg put out, including at the moment where he's changed the algorithm to be much more aggressive in terms of pushing up the negative, because they had all these experiences that makes people stay on the sites longer and share more, and emotions are what keeps people there, and negative emotions almost more than positive ones. And so the whole algorithm was geared towards, we make you stick here more, waste your time here more, and make you feel like everybody else lose their minds, so feel much more agitated and distinct from everybody else. But it still was under the same phraseology of how he originally had funded the idea of having a possibility to share pictures and stay connected with family and friends. But obviously, in order to scale that massively and to become a monopoly, he needed so much cash that he needed to have a very different business model behind it. And you can read all about how that's changed the way the company's been run, etc. And then you're still pretending people get this for free, but obviously they're not getting anything for free, because their data is, as you said, being sold for advertising or training the next generation of technology that they're using. And so this moment of shifting from the declared purpose or an original purpose into something very different is an important one. In human-made systems, even more important, because usually biological systems are geared towards survival. So you kind of know what to expect from them. Cooperative behavior, not to forget about. We tend to always say it was egotistical, but tribes tend to survive by cooperation. But obviously human-made ones, we can be much more intentionally flicking purposes around, and you know about the greenwashing, etc. So it's also intentionally done. And this is why it is so important from my point of view to really, really always look at where are we going with that technology and what drives the technology. And you have very good system thinkers like Arthur Briner that are pointing that out. They say technology is pre-considered in our minds. And then we start puzzling. And then we start looking and we observe. But as you mentioned before, we're never kind of distinct from everything. We already have an own position and an own question in our head, maybe, that leads us to see some things more than others and leads us to make connections more than others. And then when there's an incentive structure of ever faster, quicker now, as we're in right now, it's not a positive technological development anymore. It should be called arms race, which is one of the archetypes of system thinking. When you're so stuck into an accelerating dynamic that no individual player can get out without risking being at a very not good position. So you do need to have agreement to decelerate the trend. And this is where all the moratoria, etc., came in, but didn't really do anything because no one knew who was going to put it in place. So we're in a position where we're seeing accelerating trends, be it the GDP and the necessity to take out and produce ever more because we're trapped in those markets, or the technological development where everybody feels, if we don't make it, someone else was going to make it, and that's going to be terrible because their mindset is not, or even worse than ours. I don't know if we should go even in that direction. So we have to understand those dynamics and then put them out there. And again, push back on this individualized thinking. We're not talking about a new app. We're talking a completely new technosphere in the making. And we should look at it from that point of view. It's an infrastructure, at least. And infrastructure, as I always had much more supervision, had PUF, to be the German terminology there, had much more state control over it, whether it was going to hamper people or no, was going to organize access to it in a more or less equal way, equality being something, at least in liberal democracies, that was favored for the basic infrastructures of providing. And we still talk about a lot of the technological development, again, in individual itemized ways, like one more app, one more product, one more hardware, but it is an entire system already in the making. And we should be looking at it that way.
Yeah, and here you're getting at the fetish with technology, right? That it's like any problem, including problems that are created in part by technologies, the solution often by kind of what we call techno solutionists, or is to throw more technology at it rather than even asking the question like, what is technology, and whether technologies can be supportive of certain types of values of the thriving of life, right? And what did those look like? And German philosopher Martin Heidegger actually argued that technology, the root techne in the term word technology, is not just reflective of the so-called rational mind, but also the poetic, aesthetic, the visioning mind, the visioning, the imagining, not as some sort of pipe dream, but as a certain kind of way of looking beyond a narrow vision of the self toward the recognition that we're all constantly interdependent and interconnected with others, right? Like what our conversation is that we're having right now, as a very mundane example, Maja, is completely dependent. What I'm saying and thinking has everything to do with what you're bringing to the table, right? And vice versa, I hope. So absolutely. So I actually, this allows me to ask you a very specific question about German, actually. So I was told by a German friend of mine that the term, that spirituality is, and how that may even be connected, a certain kind of, here when we say spirituality, I don't mean like kind of like a new age fetish. And I also don't mean like partying, even though those are both great things. I mean more the recognition of being part of a web of life, right? The ability to be present in relation to self and other beings. But apparently the word in German for both mind and spirit is the same, Geist. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly.
Mm-hmm.
What's up with that? What do you think that conveys? I'm curious about that.
Oh, I like the question because I love looking at origins or words that we've come accustomed to using. And I've been digging that out too, because it does have the Kunstgriff is a German term. So it means Kunst is art, and Griff is some way of, you would call it handle once it's there, but it also means that you have a particular skilled way of doing something. Interfering in something. So it does have those both elements in it, which means you have to be observant of some things happening, and then in a very well-skilled way know where to interfere and do what to achieve a certain end. So I've always used that because I think it brings it out nicely, both the observing and the being clear of what is the good intervention, to not destroy, but to just allow. And Geist, yeah, it does have both. It does have this idea of the spirit, and it does have the mind. I think it's quite interesting to start wondering when it came about. I don't know if you looked it up, when where the joint roots have been and where it might have taken different developments.
I think I should. I haven't, but I think I
Okay. Okay, but yeah, I haven't. I love doing it though. I've been doing a lot about Wohlstand, which is the wealth expression now, and when it changed from meaning being well, so having good health, and it also had a beauty aspect to it, and then it's become between the 14th and the 17th century, it was moving much more in the Enlightenment era, much more to having. So it's also been a different meaning before. And so I wonder whether there have been changes in that as well. But I think it is a beautiful way of wondering about it, because sometimes this notion of spirituality being something that is not, or that goes beyond life and death of an individual person, could be some of that connection that is built into that. I'm only speculating now, right? I'm trying to get into your thinking. But obviously that is the spirit being something that we don't manage to grab. The consciousness and spirit and those things are something that kind of evade science, right? And it's still, we do know it's there, and it's hugely powerful. And then to think about how that idea of something in us leaving the body and then something around us always being there that we might be able to tap into, connect with, come closer. I think when you start thinking of what we're making reference to, one's in a bit more individualized way, possibly, and then one in the web-wise again.
Yeah, it's just something I think about because, you know, the term metaphysics has the term physics within it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we look at the history and philosophy, history of science and the history of technology. None of these, whether we speak of scientific breakthroughs or even the development of various technologies, they didn't come out of a vacuum. They came out of certain types of beliefs and approaches and even kind of ideas of how the world is or is to be or is to be ordered. And that's even true when we speak of Mark Zuckerberg, who you mentioned earlier, and Facebook. It's sometimes not widely known, even though, you know, some people know it, and some people who watched the movie The Social Network saw it in the movie as well. Facebook started as a community network for campuses, for people who live close to one another. It was supposed to be a digital layer that added on to a sense of the civic or the sense of community or sense of a campus community. And that's how it went, you know, it got popular like wildfire, because it was incubated in communities as a certain kind of like layer to social life. And it's really interesting. You've used the term social technology a few different times. And perhaps at that time, Facebook was a social technology. I think we should ask the question, what is a social technology as well? This is, I think, very important, right? I mean, the early web and internet was mainly, there was, first of all, no commerce permitted on the internet until the very late 90s. You know, that's a long time ago. I get it. But even like online communities that formed on the internet were groups of for communities and conversations. I mean, some of them were kind of, you know, psychedelic communities, like very Californian, you know, sort of things connected to the Grateful Dead, or, you know, what used to be Burning Man, which was considered very anti-commercial, actually. So there are these histories, right? And so metaphysics always precedes physics. The poetics and aesthetics and even visions, the rational ideas of techne, precede technology. And I think that's true throughout history. So I guess that's why I wanted to ask was, you know, the foregrounding of what we might call the spirit. We may call it just a vision, you know, a dream, a utopian idea, a vision of life, can always be the basis of moving and creating technology of all kinds, recognizing that technology is not just another app. Technology is permaculture. Technology is can be many different things, right? There are many kinds of technologies. So that's why I asked you that question. I was just curious how you grappled with this, because I think about this all the time myself as well. Yeah. So, you know, I want to ask you, so you know, we, in kind of the last part of our conversation, next maybe 15 minutes or so, I wanted to ask you about impact, right? So some of these ideas of how life, like I said, buen vivir earlier, like Mexican indigenous people telling me that, or I often hear, you know, I've done a lot of field work in Latin America. People tell me about, they use terms like cuidar, which is to care, sanar, which is to make sane, curar, which is to cure. You hear these words all the time. You also hear words like mano vuelta, which means the other hand, the hand turned around, like we, you know, both our hands are part of it. Or comunalidad, which is an idea that we're actually our fates are all interconnected. Those sorts of ideas are very specifically community based, right? Like, and they're not just indigenous peoples of all types. I've seen this all around the world. Community, so they're very local. They tend to be fairly small scale ideas because they're very connected to history, culture, language, cosmology, territory. But I know that our climactic challenges are planetary, and scale is critical and policy is critical. Like, it can't just be, we can't just find the path forward as gratiating as it is. You know, when from like working with the Nahuatl community in a cloud forest in Puebla in Mexico, which is what I do, you know, and other podcast guests are like that, you know, as well. So and I see you as someone in the middle of all these things, Maya. And I see you, you are very connected to the German state and the European Union and the United Nations. And I also know you really care about these kind of community visions that I'm sort of connecting to communities. How do we kind of close those loops? Are there, or close those gaps? Are there gaps? Like, I guess I'm curious about that scale versus specificity.
If I'm annoying with too much system thinking, let me know. I just found it is a way that also allows for me to structure this conversation in one particular train of thought that
I love
people
it.
then read up on and see whether they find it helpful. Because I've noticed that it allows for exactly that bridge. It allows for some of the things that you know intuitively, especially in spiritual practice, and have some of those experiences that are not being, you can't rationally explain, etc., or are trying to evade the left and right and green and black and brown kind of connotation, which always gets us into camps. Because you can just look at structures under which systems can thrive and live well. If you were looking at how to maintain, especially the things that we've been given, what we call the global commons, which is the climate, which is biodiversity, which is also the oceans and the integrity of them. But we might also think about things where it could be that we also include the global, the public goods, so the things that we've produced as humans, but that also only we can maintain when we collaborate. So some of the ones that we've inherited, because our globe had them, it was the nice little gift or giant gift that we've been given. The other we've created through cooperation, and that's peace and that's health, etc. And those only can be maintained if we collaborate to the degree of maintaining them. So we do want to understand the feedback loops that allow for them to be in dynamic development in a more or less balanced way. There's always changes in this or that direction, but if the dynamic stays somewhat stable, then we can anticipate how it works and we can fit ourselves into it. And obviously the climate discussion is the most known to everybody because we're talking about budgets of CO2 that we additionally pump into the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is a balanced system where the CO2 travels through. So we're absorbing it into trees and other, or oceans and other places, and then it's set free. And humans have accelerated the setting free by burning the fossil fuels where it was permanently bound. And this is a very, very important way of looking at it. It's not CO2 isn't bad. It is a key element of building some of our most alive structures like trees, etc. And so that's the essence of system thinking. And if you want to maintain that, you have to have the collaboration between everybody that fits into or spills into the atmosphere by burning, and that could have territory where it's absorbed. Looking after the other global commons, the biodiversity is aligned with looking at after climate change if you do it well, because it is forests, it is big scale forest where biodiversity is thriving, but also that we do need to bind enough CO2. And the oceans shouldn't tip so that all the fish, etc., and all the live creatures in there die, and a lot of people depending on fish proteins, etc., for their dietary basis basically are not having enough access to food anymore, is also consonant with having the possibility to bind more CO2 in it. And this is why it's so beautiful. It's so amazing how nature has a balance, or how the development, it's not balanced out for us. That's a romantic way of looking at it. But we've been living in this particular point in historic development that's been so absolutely benign to us as a species. And we're screwing it up because we're not understanding how this works and how we might then be so innovative and so creative and so at the same time humble to be able to maintain this. And that only works when you collaborate. And it's called the tragedy of the commons when you think of it, right? Because if we don't collaborate, then we take more and more because we think unless we do it, someone else was going to do it, and then they're better off and it's going to collapse anyway. So why should I hold back? I'll take the most I can and maybe store it somewhere. And so then we have about 3 ways of dealing with this, with what Gerhard Haddon said in 1968. And I know he's not a nice fellow later on, but at that point in time, he gave some good scientific ideas as an ecologist. And he said, we have 3 different ways of managing it. Either you make everybody understand this, and then they start behaving like they behave in a benign way of maintenance. And that works usually in a smaller community. You can have this much more there. But if it's anonymous, if it's a long distance differentiation, etc., how are you going to have that kind of trust and the notion of everybody knows enough? The second one would be, which is the privatization angle, to say we're going to chuck it up in pieces, but then everybody who's using their piece should also have to deal with the consequences of overusing it if they do, which is obviously absolutely not the case, because we're over consuming in some parts of the world and the consequences are falling on everybody else's head but ours. So that kind of government approach or governance approach isn't working either. And so the third one left over, and that's exactly the international political one, was to say, how can we find rules that are holding for everybody, that are not too restrictive, but that are making sure that everybody stays within this realm of not overusing, and that we can rely on the rules to hold for everybody? That then will create trust, and then will mean that we can all maintain it. So you do need this. And interestingly, as a last point to that, in system thinking, hierarchy is viewed as that. Hierarchy is not a thing which is a pyramid, where some people at the top, very few of them, tell everybody else what they have to do or they're going to be chucked out. Hierarchy in system thinking means that the higher levels should be working at the service of the lower levels to be able to thrive, because the differentiation and the diversity is crucial for any system that wants to stay alive and be resilient, because you have repositories of alternatives in those different pockets. So the hierarchy element is the higher ones serving the health of the lower ones. And that means you have to listen, and that means you have to understand, and that means that you have a subsidiary system, we'd call it in the EU, which tried that. So which are the bigger frameworks that we have to have in place on the higher levels? But then how do you allow for diversity? So we're not making everything the same, because it won't help. On the lower scales. And then, yeah, it's just going to have to fluctuate and be negotiated over and again when things change a lot. But that's the idea of hierarchy in systems.
I mean, that's a brilliant answer, Maya. I mean, in a way, because you're actually giving us a lens into supporting all these different kinds of community initiatives, while also supporting policies that allow for the expression of those, but critically the ability for those to bridge with other groups. And so policy or impact is sort of part of a pipeline of communication and conversation, rather than something that's forced down the throats of others in a often misguided way, even if it's well-intentioned. That's really, really powerful. And I think that, because, for example, in the US, I'm sure you follow this, when the Green New Deal, when that was announced in the context of, the Sanders campaign, and by people like Representative Ocasio-Cortez and others who were all part of this campaign that I worked on in my own small way, it was immediately seen as some sort of commie socialist thing, rather than a recognition, which, many people who might consider themselves part of the right in the US, or some at least, have a deep love of nature, as well. So quickly things were seen, at least in the politics, as a certain kind of turf war, like you're either with me or against me, right? Like this kind of idea, the prisoner's dilemma, like this idea that like, oh, anything that Maya's going to put up, she's the other, is going to be inherently, it's coded by language of politics, left, right, whatever you want to call it, rather than here's a vision that actually is built upon a support of our interconnection, our interrelations with one another. So how we can get there, I think, is going to be a huge challenge. This is a big problem here in the United States with this election coming up, and it comes up all the time. And part of it is social media that quickly constructs an invisible, what are called social graph technologies, which are actually antisocial technologies. They construct in-group, out-group dynamics. And this is done invisibly, algorithmically, through the ways data is being computed and constructed. But also the problem is our media, our mainstream media, our so-called legacy media, are interested, are also dependent on a similar toxic model of more attention, more outrage. It's why the former president is constantly covered in the media. There's an obsession with him. And that's sometimes even true in the progressive media sphere as well, here in the US. So I want to just kind of close our conversation with like two other questions. First, I want to ask you about yourself personally. I know I'm really curious about how you kind of came up as a scholar, but also a very much a publicly engaged one. An activist in many ways, and someone who, how have, like, where did that come from in your own life, like personally even? And how has that been for you? Like, why did you choose to go into academia and then kind of go into the public sphere? Or like, what kind of led to this path for you? Was it, for example, I know there was a anti-nuclearization movement in Germany in the 80s and 90s as an example of that. There are these other movements that existed. And then I also want to ask you about your next book. Like, what's that about, and how can we read your work and access your work?
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. Yeah, I think the growing up is actually, has really shaped my outlook on life. And I've been very much on the ecological side in our conversation today, but I've also always had, I call it the benefit of going to schools that were really trying to bring together people from all walks of life. So it was reform schools. I grew up in where the 68 parents were in power, right? So I've grown up with 3 families in one house. We'd had a lot of gardening going around. We were going to all 6 kids to the same school. We've had separate families, but we were still the same amount of adults as kids, and we really loved it. We all agree that it was great to be able to just go up to other parents when ours were not such friends at the day. So it helps in puberty and those times when you have different people to relate to. And I think that in itself allowed for me to start understanding, even though we've all come from very privileged backgrounds, that or parents that had high paying, they were doctors and teachers. So that's been the remit that we've had. But they were very aware of how people develop, right? Both in their health area, but also in education. And in our school, it was complete mix. So it was a selection from not too many academic background kids and from every angles of life. And I felt that was very, very instructive for me. We did a lot of project work, so very explorative, not someone telling us, but us finding out was more the approach. And you were always in groups. So you started noticing how others are approaching things and look at things and what was normal for them and no. And I think the same then held for, Chernobyl was very, very, very influential, because for the first time, you were told you couldn't go outside. You could not eat any of the things you're used to. We've had milk powder in a massive big bag in the storage room. And it was like, oh, and no mushroom hunting, which we'd love to do every fall that year, no nuts. And you still couldn't see or feel anything. You just had these weird instruments that were telling you there's something potentially very dangerous. And this was maybe the introduction to system thinking, right? Because you knew something far away was having an impact here. And it was going to have an impact for a while, even though the accident has passed, because the stuff sunk in, it was absorbed and then comes back out with the things that grow. And so I think it's from the angle of how I look at the world now, it's kind of been my upbringing. But the funny thing is that journalists always ask me then if I've been indoctrinated by my parents to become the way I am. And I was like, you mean more indoctrinated than the kids that were forced meat down their throats every single day and were told they had to have big cars for them to be successful? Where does indoctrination start for you? We're just being brought up differently. Isn't that a good thing? Because we can then also look at the world differently. And this is how I basically went through my path. I went to media communication studies first because I thought people just need to know, and then they're all going to change how they're looking and doing things in the world. And then I thought, actually, I need to know something about psychology. And at the time, we had very open possibilities in German universities still. You have a 4-year diploma degree, and it was never taking up your time. So I could do a lot of bartending on the side, which was nice as well, and do some language. And I just loved to understand different things. I loved being in different languages. I loved trying out courses in sociology and political science. And then I went for my PhD to understand capitalism. And that was fantastic. I went to York University in Toronto, and it was all about history of economic thought and very applied. And again, it was a place where 70% were foreigners in the courses, and it was people coming back from practice, being engaged in the ANC in South Africa, having been in prison in China, having been in anarchist movement in Greece or Turkey. And so we always had people that had the experiences of trying to influence societal developments and came back to reflect. And I still consider that to be the gift of my path, that I had the opportunity to be inside of trying to understand and immerse myself in practice. I did that through my PhD, campaigning on WTO issues for an environmental organization, whilst writing on world trade. And so it was this constant where I felt, theory and application. And it's actually the kind of approach of one of my favorite theoreticians, which is Antonio Gramsci.
Absolutely.
And that's how I became who I was. And this is probably what caused, to come back to our beginning of the conversation, that people at one point felt, when I got too much influence on media and talk shows, why does this person that doesn't fit any category, why does she get all this attention? I think it must have been one of the things, because the German society is very rigid, right? You're supposed to fit somewhere. I was a misfit. So I think that was part of the things that people didn't like, but I feel it really helped me be a generalist, and maybe some of them are helpful.
Yeah, I mean, even if you don't sort of fit within these boxes, I felt and saw firsthand that the sort of spirit and message you have, which wasn't about shaming anyone, but kind of opening up our vocabulary to look at interconnections, the systems vision, and so on. I saw firsthand how well that was received, and I was so happy that is well received. That's not something I'm always used to seeing. That's amazing. You know, one of the most famed translators of Antonio Gramsci is, I believe his name is Malcolm Buttigieg, but he's the father of the Secretary of Infrastructure and Transportation in Biden's cabinet, Pete Buttigieg, who ran as an extremely neoliberal centrist Democrat, and worked his way, I'm not saying he doesn't deserve it, but worked his way into Biden's cabinet. So it's, one of the most famed translators of Gramsci, especially like the prison notebooks and so on, is I think his name is Malcolm Buttigieg, but we can fact check that later. I think it's also interesting what you say about the communities that inspired you, that were from people of all around the planet, and how that can incubated a systems thinking in its own right within you. Because now what we have are the failures of an absence of systems thinking. We see it climactically, right? Like we see massive tropical storms like come to Southern California, which is one of the very dry climate that a lot of people are not used to seeing rain at. Or we see heat waves coming to British Columbia. This all relates to what, Naomi Klein, who I'm sure you know or know her work, describes in her new book as sort of this doppelganger kind of phenomenon. It's not just happening online, but it's also in the weirdness and uncanniness of life that has gone in sort of Frankensteinian directions. But we can get back to it. We can get back to systems thinking and interconnection with humility to all. So, all right. So final question for you, like, tell us about your new book or your last book, how we all can keep up with what you're doing. So tell us a little bit about that, and your sort of larger dream or vision, or maybe utopian idea, if you even like that term, for life.
Well, I have one book is already out and it's open access. It's called The Great Mind Shift. It's more for people coming from a science background. It does draw together transformation research with political economy on sustainability issues. I felt the transformation scholars are really good at looking how things change, and the political economists were very much knowing what has to change in the kind of steering grammar, and they weren't at the same conferences. So just as you said, there's all these different pockets. You have epistemic communities in science, and you have your conferences that you go to. And so this is the attempt. And then the next ones are being translated. One is already out. It was the German #3 bestseller of the year after Obama.
And wow, awesome.
Yeah. No, it was very surprising, because I didn't think it had anything that new in it, but it was written just for very easy access. You can just read it through like that. It's called Rethinking Our World. And it just tries to bridge some of the either ors. So I went into starting humans and nature, as you said at the beginning, and then all the chapters are trying to say why state or market is the wrong way to look at it, why technology or consuming less is the wrong way to look at it, because in reality they're always mixed, they're always intertwined, right? And then the next book was actually System Thinking, and that's being translated. I just got the final transcript in English, so it's coming out. We Can Do Better. It's coming out next year, and that's the whole, basically a lot of things I said today. I try to, again, do with a lot of storytelling. So that's the attempt to really try to make system thinking accessible for people in all different sectors to start using it more. And now I've started my little social startup on science communication, which is pursuing the question of value, because I felt this could be the next bridge building entry point. So how we get out of green against this and that, to say, what is value in the 21st century? And how do we protect, regenerate, and create it best? And then you can come from a design point of view to say which indicator is actually expressing it well, which cost-benefit analysis is close to what we would say are values, now talking about the stocks, the kind of valuable things that we have to produce stuff for us, so very economic in that way. And how do those instruments that we've built, this is why I come from social technologies, the kind of incentives, the inbuilt valuation in our economic models, the subsidies, etc., they all steer us in a particular way. And it is that steering effect, the human-built structures, do they help us achieve our societal goals or no? And then not say science is not telling us where you want to go, because we have those sustainable development goals, international contracts, etc. And we can redesign the structures that we've created to help us achieve the goals. And then you are in some space which psychologists tell us is very helpful, especially at very dire times as they are right now, which is value congruence. When the things that you do, so the lived purpose and the structures that you're living under or operating under in each organization, it goes through KPIs of who's being promoted in the company, etc. Is that steering us towards the declared purpose, our goals, or is that making it very hard for all of us?
Well, it's amazing. Consider me a friend and an ally to that and everything that you do, Maja. So I'm just very grateful for your time. Thank you for joining us today, Maja.
Thank you very much, Ramesh, for the invitation and for bringing all these voices out.
The Utopias podcast with Professor Ramesh Srinivasan is produced and edited by me, Phoebe Browse. You can access episodes on all streaming platforms. And if you have questions or comments, please email podcastutopias@gmail.com. That's podcastutopias@gmail.com. See you all next time.